And I'd like to say a thank you and good morning to everyone. It is almost the weekend. For a few of us, it'll be here a lot sooner than the rest of you. I've been in the office since a little after 3 o'clock this morning, and that may be why it feels a little bit more like the end of the day than perhaps some of you are actually experiencing right now. If you're on your way to work, well, have a great day. Have a great day because we are expecting a wonderful day when it comes to sunshine and warmth a little later. A little cooler this weekend, but no rain in sight until Tuesday or so, and really a beautiful day on Monday when you head back to work, of course. But it'll still be nice enough if you wanted to do some gardening, get outside and do those things this weekend. Perfect time to be doing all of that. I have a number of people who are going to be joining us a little later in the program. First of all, in the next half hour, Elizabeth Allen Hodge is going to be joining. Excuse me, I am having an issue here with some what you call reflux again. You know, I think what it was is the omelet I warmed up and had just before I went on the air. I cooked it yesterday. I got to be honest with you. I cooked this thing yesterday, and then I put it into one of those microwavable dishes. And when I actually warmed it here in the microwave when I walked in today, the thing actually expanded. I don't know how that happens, but it just kept getting foamier and foamier and foamier. So I'm dealing with a little bit of what they call reflux action from that today. I got to get one of those They do those new things where they wrap a band around in there, and that's supposed to eliminate that. The only thing is it's a little what they call invasive. They have to cut you open to do it. So I'm a little hesitant about doing something like that. But in the meantime, yes, we have a guest coming up a little later from the Northwest Regional Patriot Academy between 8:30 and 9 o'clock this morning. Also, guests from College of Southern Idaho at 8:20 this morning. And at 9:20 today, we have a guest from the Boy Scouts of America talking about a big event taking place this weekend. So those are things I wanted to tell you about. But I wanted to really mention at the top of the show, the top of the program today, something I happened to see because, look, we spent a lot of time after Ted Cruz announced for president a couple of weeks ago, sort of breaking that down and talking about it. But we didn't spend a lot of time talking about the following announcement, and that came earlier this week from his fellow Republican Rand Paul. Now, the two of them are said to be, by some people in media, at each other's throats, but Cruz has pointed out that they're really the best of friends in the Senate. And I think that is probably true. They have worked together very, very closely, along with Utah's Mike Lee, on several issues that a lot of people, well, in our listening audience, would find near and dear. And so I bring that up, and I mention that because I think that the media, with what we're seeing happen already, is starting to set up its double standard for next year's presidential election. Forget that Hillary Clinton destroyed evidence by wiping clean her server and that May have been lying through her teeth about what was on it and is not fully cooperative. They will be, of course, behind her 100%, selling you on the idea that the country needs her, but these Republicans are just mean, they're racist, and they hate women. There you go. But I came across something from a writer named Molly Hemingway writing at The Federalist, and she says, finally, Rand Paul exposes media's serious abortion double standards. Now, there are some people out there who are bashing Rand Paul right now, saying that he's a peacenik, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I have been a follower of his family because I'm a Paulite. I'll admit it. I've supported his dad in the past, voted for his dad in primaries, never got a chance to vote for his dad in a general election. But the reason that from their vantage point, what they're talking about is the expense of all of this. Why do we have military facilities in 180 countries around the world? That's a good question. Some of them may not be needed. You know, we've got countries in Europe. Germany has a great booming economy because we defend them. Maybe it's time we started asking some of these other people to pick up the tab. So I'm not going to be beating up on the Paul family or on Rand Paul because I just think a lot of that is coming from some folks who just simply want same old, especially if they have some ties to the neoconservatives in the Republican Party and Wall Street because, hey, war's good for business, right? At least their business, if not everybody else's business from time to time. They sometimes mistake their own interests with national interests, and I think that's unfortunate. But Molly Hemingway, writing at The Federalist, says, you see so many things going on in media, what they're talking about. She said, for instance, she was on a radio show talking with a fellow about same-sex media who tried to tell her that this was what the American public wants. She says, it's an absolutely stunning claim. She said, set aside same-sex marriage, which the media are just completely incapable of covering with even a semblance of fairness or awareness of how people outside their newsrooms think about it. And that's very true. They're selling this as being this is the right thing to do. You read newspaper editorials, and these editorialists who have no moral background and don't go to church or anything like that have decided that they are the arbiters of right and wrong in this country, and they will. I've seen it in multiple editorials. It's the right thing to do. According to whom? You? Most of you people in the newspaper industry can't sober up for more than 3 hours a day. And we expect to, you expect us to follow you? I don't think so. She said, let's set aside the cautious assumption that if these issues hurt Democrats in 2014, it's not because of voters' response to those issues, but something about foreign policy or the economy. In other words, she's saying that right now media is in denial that any of these positions could hurt Democrats going into next year. She says, I'll give you a few examples. Guns. She writes, can we think of a single instance where Republican defense of the Second Amendment right did anything other than to help win elections for Republicans? Great point. In fact, if we get to it a bit later, there was a poll, and it was done by the Washington Times. We do not get governed by polls, by the way, but they're good snapshots of how people are going to vote, aren't they? And the Washington Times says a lot of Democrats are very angry with President Obama for being anti-gun because they know it's going to sting next year. Here's another topic, abortion. Likewise, let's look at how actual Americans outside of newsrooms report their views. Did you know, she writes, that 71% of Americans support at least some protections for unborn children? That number is getting up near 3/4. And when you figure that probably 10 to 15% of the people on the phone went, huh? 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 Believe me, I've done push polling. I know how those calls go. So you eliminate 15% are just completely brain dead. So 71% of 85% believe that there should be some restrictions on this. You wouldn't know it, though, by following fellows in the mainstream media. And she says Rand Paul has mentioned the donkey in the room. Many in the media have been more or less unable to hide their general disdain for Paul, who announced his bid for the presidency. Many in the media have also been more or less unable to hide the fact that they take their marching orders from Planned Parenthood, the country's largest seller of abortion service. Now, Planned Parenthood has actually been putting some money into the attacks on Rand Paul. Did you know that? She mentions it here. Planned Parenthood is involved in so many things. I hate to hurt their feelings, but when I see the little girls selling Girl Scout cookies at the store, and I can't walk by them without, would you like to buy some cookies? And then on the way back out, would you like to buy some cookies? And I don't want to go over and hurt their feelings and say, no, I do not support abortion, because they wouldn't know that. No one's told them that. That's been left out of the explanation at the Girl Scout meetings. The writer Molly Hemingway goes on to say, I'm not sure if any reporter did ask Debbie Wasserman Schultz about her views, because you remember Rand Paul was being criticized and a reporter said, well, Debbie Wasserman Schultz says you're an extremist when it comes to your belief about abortion and that we should have it outlawed. And he said, why don't you go ask her what her views are? So the writer says, I'm not sure if any reporter did ask Wasserman Schultz about her views, but she volunteered that she favors zero restrictions on abortion. And a good reporter will follow up with her to make sure she meant what she said. She probably did, since it's also her party's platform. That would be the Democrats, the Marxist liberals who currently think that they run the country, at least through the media. The writer goes on to say, as I wrote, when the media had a wee bit of trouble for years coming up with any story ideas whatsoever for coverage of the murder trial of serial murderer and abortionist Kermit Gosnell. Now, do you know this story? Kermit Gosnell was running an abortion clinic in Philadelphia and a second one in Wilmington, Delaware. In Delaware, where Beau Biden, the vice president's son, was the attorney general, the younger Mr. Biden said they didn't have enough evidence to go after him. He wanted to wash his hands of it. But this guy Gosnell was snipping if a baby was born alive, he'd snip the spinal cord of it with scissors. And he would make, wisecracks about the babies being so large that they could have walked him to the bus stop. And he's now sitting at a prison somewhere. Media did not want to cover that story. In fact, at the Washington Post, apparently one blithering idiot, when confronted about it, said, that's a local story. We cover Washington. And someone had to go out and point out that in stories like this, they often go all over the world to cover them. Even some of the liberals had to admit that was a really pee-poor defense. I'd clean that up a little bit. The writer says that she can go back to the story about a Senate race in Missouri a few years ago when Todd Akin, who was a Republican candidate, made a mistake when he said women being raped, that they could not get pregnant. She went out and she decided to tabulate how many times the New York Times reported that story. 250 stories in under 3 months. So they ignored this Butcher Gosnell, but they went out of their way to portray this Republican candidate as being somewhat of a rube and being uncaring about women who are raped, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And this was the New York Times justification for abortion. But again, they ignored, in their own backyard practically, from New York to Philadelphia, it's a short drive. They ignored that story almost exclusively about a man who was killing little babies in his office under the guise of providing abortion services. And the charges were legion. I mean, it was just amazing. He was ignoring laws. He was bringing women in just before they would normally deliver and killing the babies. And it just went on like a mill over and over and over again with very little media attention. And the writer goes on to say, pro-choice views aren't news. You will not get pro-choice views covered in media. Look, I know this. I have been to the annual March for Life in Washington. The year I was there, we had 400,000 people there. A lot of them were children who came from schools all over the country. They were being bussed in. And you know what? Barely a mention on the nightly news, barely a mention in any newspapers. Now, that event has only grown. I think in this past year they had over 500,000. 500,000 people coming to Washington and marching down a street is a big story. I'm sorry. And yet they can't get any coverage. Well, that's old news, is what we hear. Baloney. 500,000 people gathered in any spot is news. And you've got to look at it that way. So Mr. Paul has called out the media, and I hope that he and other Republicans will start taking this tack, taking this approach with what they're doing coming in 2016. Because if they don't, they'll get eaten alive. We are up against, from my perspective, and I'm a registered Republican, we are up against two forces. The enemy, that would be the Democrats, and believe me, they are the enemy. There are so many scurrilous people at the top of that party. You know, maybe your neighbor down the street who's a Democrat doesn't understand that. That person, you need to tell them that they are being run by a cabal of very devious people, and obviously they have blood on their hands, that Gosnell case being a good example of it. But here's the thing. We are not only up against them. We are up against this great big media machine, along with Hollywood and along with the rest of the entertainment industry and academia. This is a multifaceted front. And we have got to be out quick on our feet, and we have got to be ready to challenge these people, because if you don't, then we're going to get Mitt Romney again playing Casper Milquetoast. Well, I don't want to hurt anybody's feelings. Or John McCain. Well, I'd rather not be president than have someone mention that Mr. Obama's middle name is Hussein. Good. You're not president, John. I don't know, folks. We got to do something, and we better do it fast. We have some guests coming up, several of them this morning. I have a guest coming up from the College of Southern Idaho. Big events going on there as usual throughout the weekend and over the next week. Details on all of that. Also, the Northwest Patriot Academy, a guest coming up talking about that in the next half hour. Bill Colley with you on Top Story this morning. It's 35. Got to tell you right now, 8:20, and if you've been outside, it is a little chilly. You can see your breath, but it's a beautiful morning, and the air is just crisp and clear. Ella Donahue has gotten so used to this that she's able to give me instructions as we actually go on the air. She said to me just before I turned on the microphone, she said, "Is my microphone on?" She has been here before, obviously. Joining us from the College of Southern Idaho on Top Story. This is News Radio 1310 KLIX and newsradio1310.com. Hey, quickly, too, I just wanted to share with everyone that my good friends at Western States Bus Services are hiring part-time bus drivers right now, split shifts, 5 days per week, summers off, and scheduled no school days. Pay is $10.75 per hour. You can apply today by contacting 733-8003. Western States Bus Services is an equal opportunity employer. Ella, busy as usual because you've got, 4 radio stations to talk to this morning. So
yes, sir.
So we've got a lot to get to right away. Arts on Tour. Masters of Soul. That sounds like music.
Yes, you've still got time to get tickets for that. That's a very large and talented ensemble of performers who do spot-on tributes to Diana Ross and the Supremes, Smokey Robinson, The Temptations, and many more legendary Motown performances. It's going to be at CSI Fine Arts Auditorium at 7:30 tonight. Tickets are $28 for adults and $10 for students.
Are you going?
No, I have to go do a other thing tonight.
I was going to say, these are all your grandparents musicians anyway, right?
Yeah.
Some of them very talented. A few of them still around. Well, and for people who wanted to pick up tickets, do they just go to the box office or the web?
Yes, they can go to the box office since it's tonight and stuff, and then they just say, hey, I want to get into this. And I believe there's still tickets because they're trying to give tickets to the CSI students, so there's definitely a lot of room, I think.
Okay. Well, we'll see if we can't get it sold out this morning. And then you've got a couple of other things. No, this one's interesting. Date night with a CSI Early Childhood Education Club.
Yes, so that's going to be students and instructors that are going to give your kids expert care in the full equipped child care lab on Falls Avenue from 5:30 to 9:30 Friday evening, April 17th. It's just going to be $15 per kid. That's less than $3 an hour to watch your kids. And they get pizza, ice cream, and lots of fun activities. And you and your spouse or date can get 4 hours out. To sign up, call Kelsey Skinner at 732-6884.
Next week, Friday, right? So
Yes.
Check the movie listings, folks, so you know where you're going when you actually drop the kids off. You know, the ice cream, actually, there's probably something in chemical compound in ice cream that will help them sleep, too. So once you get home, you can get them to bed early, too, and you don't have to worry about them bouncing off the walls or anything like that. You know, if they were sitting there drinking Mountain Dew, on the other hand, then you'd have a...
Then you'd have a little bit of a problem.
You also have the CSI Senate is having first Golden Eagle Disc Golf Tournament. Now, that sounds like a lot of fun.
Yes, it's going to be Saturday, April 25th, 10 a.m. at the Eagle Creek Disc Golf Course at CSI campus, and there's going to be a lot of different divisions to enter. So if you're a little worried because you're like, oh, I've never played this before, we have stuff for you. They've got advanced for $25, intermediate for $20, novice for $15, women for $15, children for $5, and all CSI students will receive an extra $5 off with their current student ID. And if you pre-register, players will get a extra $5 off as well, except for the children because they're only $5. All proceeds will go to benefit the CSI students in scholarships at the CSI Foundation. Registration will begin at 8 a.m., then a player meeting at 9:30 a.m., and 10 a.m. will be tee-off. Now, if you want to pre-register, you're going to need to email goldeneagle4, the number 4, disc@gmail.com by April 24th. And if you have any questions, I'll answer them on your email. And there's also going to be a luncheon and awards following scoring. So it's going to be a fun afternoon, so come out and join the CSI Senate.
We used to call that Frisbee golf, but now there's some competitors, so some of the discs are made by other people, right?
Yeah.
I haven't played this game in years. So it was one of those things we did a lot as teenagers to while away the time, but I haven't done it. Once you get to a certain age, Ella, you won't know this for a long time, 20 years, 25 years probably, you'll lose your interest in discs and Frisbees and the like.
I don't even play it now.
Oh, okay. I was going to say, she's a little more mature than most of the students. So.
Yeah.
And then, hey, I love this. The Highland Games.
Yes, the CSI Highland Games are going to be coming Saturday, the 25th of April, and there's going to be more details on that coming soon. So you can come to the disc tournament, and then you can go watch the Highland Games.
Where they instead of a Frisbee, what they're doing is they're tossing around a big sack of haggis or something like that.
Yeah, see, look, you're going to have a fun afternoon on April 25th, so come out to CSI.
I've gone to some of these Highland and Scottish games before, and the people take it very seriously. Some of them are in their kilts.
Oh, they're all in their kilts. They're all like dressed up. They've got their family crests and stuff like that, all that kind of stuff.
Throwing logs around.
Yeah.
They're tossing logs one direction or another, and then the guys have the great big bags, and it looks like a football goalpost, and they toss the bag over. Well, you know, they're cousins to the Irish. They're all Celtic peoples. So no wonder that looks strange to all of us.
They even had last year, they had these couple of booths with like swords and daggers and stuff like that from like kind of Scottish and Irish like background and stuff. So that was really cool. I actually bought a couple daggers last year.
I was going to say claymores were the big ones, right? The big heavy swords that the Scottish...
They had the huge big heavy ones. And then they had like little like ones that fit on your like leg. They had those ones there. And then they also had like letter openers that were like long and thin. It was so cool.
Amazing, because, you know, the Scots are a race of only about 5 feet 5 inches tall that they could have such big swords.
I know, right?
Ella, thank you very much. We'll do this again either next week or the week following. I know your schedule varies from time to time.
Yes, I won't be here next week, but I will be here the following week.
All right, super. We've got more coming up in just a moment. Going to be talking about the Northwest Patriot Academy right here on News Radio 1310 KLIX and newsradio1310.com. You're listening to Top Story with Bill Colley. I have a guest on the line with us who'll be joining us in just a second, but by way of introduction, she's here to talk to us about, well, first of all, I'm I looked over the website of the organization, and I've got to tell you, I'm glad there are people out there who are picking up the pieces and talking to young people and people really everywhere about the Constitution and the meaning of it, because let's be honest, we don't have, and I notice this just when I'm talking with people on the street or I'm on Facebook or any of social media. People don't really know, I think, what their rights are. I don't think that they really understand what the Constitution means. And I think often that's why this country, we find ourselves getting into so much trouble, either en masse or sometimes individually. It's 8:36 right now at our studios. Bill Colley with you on Top Story on News Radio 1310 KLIX and newsradio1310.com. And I want to welcome Elizabeth Allen Hodge to the program this morning. And hey, I know you've done this with Kelly in the past, but this is the first time we've gotten a chance to actually talk, and I want to thank you for that.
Thank you, Bill. It's a pleasure being here.
To point out for people now, around Idaho, you have been a relatively well-known name for a long, long time from your involvement, political involvement, and some service in government and the like. But you really have focused more of your efforts, I guess, in recent years on this academy, right?
Well, this is the first year that this academy has been offered. I was involved with an academy out of Texas called the Patriot Academy. This is the Northwest Liberty Academy, and there's a difference between both serve a purpose, both have good things to offer, but whereas they focused more on the legislative process and had a mock legislative session for 3 days, we will focus on all three branches of government. The students will be versed in all three branches. They'll actually get a personal tour of all three branches by elected officials. Take, for instance, the Secretary of State will take them through his office. The Treasurer will take them through his office. We have a Supreme Court Justice Dan Eisman, who's going to take them through the Supreme Court. And then there are legislators who will explain to them the difference, how a bicameral legislature operates, the difference between the two houses. So they will have an overview of all three branches, but then beyond the Constitution and beyond the three branches of government and their proper roles, we will focus in on private property rights and the free market system, free enterprise, and how that affects us. And basically, we're teaching the principles of a free society and free enterprise, and how in order to have a free and moral society, you have to have a free and moral marketplace.
I would think that for young people who would get involved in a program like this, and we often see, we refer to them as slackers, or we disparage people younger people because maybe they play video games, and of course, for a lot of us, that predates us. But I would think that for a lot of them, when they actually get this opportunity, it's a thrill for them. I mean, it really is, even if they've never experienced it before.
Well, yes, because take, for instance, they will, we will be offering a mentorship program so that after the academy, after the symposium in June, they can be mentored by an entrepreneur or a business person who will explain to them and answer questions throughout the year. They can actually call them and talk to them about what it takes to operate a business. They will, in class, learn some very basics about the free market and free enterprise. We have Jason Richards from FEE, which is the Foundation for Economic Education, who will be talking to them. Tom Woods, who is an author and a historian, and he's with the Mises Institute, will also be talking to both the students and adults. Our classes are for students 12 years old up through adult. There's no upper age limit. And so they will have an opportunity to meet with business people and with national authors and speakers about how our government works and how the free market system works, and then be mentored by local business and entrepreneurs who will help them understand the free enterprise system more.
I have to admit that it was actually some young people that I used to work with in talk radio, or younger people, who brought Mises to my attention, and then I started hearing about him on Glenn Beck's program, and he has influenced a lot of our leading lights in Washington today. We were just talking in the last half hour about Rand Paul. People like him have been reading up, of course, on the economics that he wrote about long ago, but they're having a huge impact today on us culturally. We have a break coming up shortly. I'd like to ask you if you can stick around for a few more minutes through the break, and we can go into a little bit more detail about how a young person might get involved.
My pleasure.
I do want to point out our guest, Elizabeth Allen Hodge, joining us this morning on News Radio 1310 KLIX and newsradio1310.com. And she's talking about the Northwest Regional Liberty Academy. And we've got more details on that. If you'd like to get involved, or your children would like to get involved, or your grandchildren would like to get involved, she's going to have some details in just a few minutes on how you can go about doing that. We're going to call it 8:40. It's 36 at our studios. Bill Colley with you on Top Story on News Radio 1310 KLIX and newsradio1310.com. Our guest in this segment of the program, Elizabeth Allen Hodge, she is joining us from the Northwest Regional Liberty Academy and spending a few minutes talking with us about its mission and how you could get involved as well. And it's really I think it'll open a lot of people's eyes if they participate. I got a little short story to tell on my own. And if you really do reach the young people, you can have a tremendous impact. When I was in the 7th grade, and I think I had just turned maybe 12 years old, wasn't yet 13, we got on a bus in my hometown, a group of us, and they took us a 6-hour drive to the state capitol. Growing up in western New York State, it was a 6-hour drive to Albany. And they took us to the state capitol, and we got off the bus, and we stood out in front of that magnificent edifice where Theodore Roosevelt, when he had been the governor, it was said that he used to challenge reporters that if they could make it to the top of the stairway with him, they could get an interview. Nobody ever did. He was in great shape. They couldn't keep up with him. But we got to tour this fantastic building, and at that point, that's where I really fell in love with government. First, it was the visible, and then I started wondering, how does it work? What are the nuts and bolts? And it was inspirational in that sense. And I think we were talking in the last segment about how the young people who get involved with the academy get to actually go through the building, but meet with the people who are involved and get their questions answered. And that's what I think whets the appetite for wanting to learn more. And I would ask my guest Elizabeth Allen Hodge, would you agree with that?
Yes, I think we've all been impressed by people during our lifetime. For me, it was sitting in a judge's chair as he spoke to us about the law and how it was meant to protect us and to protect our private property rights. But you're absolutely right. And one of the things that our Secretary of State, Lawrence Denny, will be doing as he takes them through his office is he will be talking to them about Thomas Jefferson's charge to all of us toward eternal vigilance and what that means. He'll talk about how his office oversees the voting, but that as a citizen, our job is more than just to go in and vote and have a little sticker that said, I voted. Our job is to make sure that the people that we hire to represent us via the voting process are people of character and people who will keep their oath of office to uphold the Constitution.
It's no harm in reminding people of that, but a lot of people first maybe getting involved or taking an interest in this, they have to know that there's an old George Will line. I cited it on the program yesterday from a column I remember reading that he must have written 20 years ago, where he said too often he thinks people in public office treat it as their private property. Sometimes they forget. And I mean, and obviously you're isolated sometimes, and that may easily be done. But if you can just sometimes remind people of their obligation, it snaps them back to reality, doesn't it?
Well, you certainly hope that it does. Unfortunately, I served for 6 years, and one of the most disconcerting things was to see people take the oath of office and then just totally ignore it. It was kind of like a rite of passage. And it was like, okay, now we are elected officials, party on. And then there was very little regard given to the Constitution after that by some.
What is the mission statement of your organization?
Our mission is to teach the principles of a free society and free enterprise, beginning with the founders' acknowledgement that men are by nature free and derive their natural rights from God, not government, that the proper role of good government is to protect the inalienable rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and that free enterprise is the right of the people to engage in a free and moral exchange of ideas, goods, and services. To that end, we endeavor to help students identify these principles and to recognize the unintended consequences that occur when elected officials and citizens base priorities on politics over principles.
It's 8:48. Our guest is Elizabeth Allen Hodge. She is joining us from the Northwest Regional Liberty Institute, spending some time with us this morning on News Radio 1310 KLIX and newsradio1310.com. This is Top Story with Bill Colley. For people who would like to actually, if somebody is hearing this and they say, gee, I have a 17-year-old son or grandson or daughter, and I'd like to get them involved, what would you recommend they do?
They can do one of two things. They can go to our website, which is nwlibertyacademy.org, or they're welcome to call me at 208-869-1709. And we can, on our website, it does say that, what the students will be doing and who's on our program. It shows a list of everybody not of everybody, but of the national speakers and some of the local speakers. There will be other speakers coming as well that I think they'll be very pleased with. We've got Chris Ann Hall, who will open our program. She's from Liberty First. She's a constitutional attorney and will be talking about our founding documents. And then, as I said, we've got Tom Woods from the Mises Institute and a number of others. So they can go to our website or call me and find out more.
The question you were mentioning a couple of minutes ago about your inspiration when you were younger, when you heard a judge speak, and that really, your interest in how this whole system worked and what it was all about started to grow at that point. You served, as you pointed out, 6 years in the state legislature. Having done that, and then you left. What motivated you? Because I think a lot of people may say, okay, I've done 6 years, I've done my duty, and then they say, I've had enough. They walk away from government. They don't get involved anymore. What has kept the fire burning for you in that sense?
Well, I believe that this is the freest country in the world, and I believe that it started on godly principles and an acknowledgement that our rights come from God. And I did a self-imposed term limitation because I believe in a citizen legislature, not professional politicians. And so I didn't say that my service would end, just that my public service at that point would end. And what I wanted to do is, my love is to work with children. My background is Christian education. That's what I did before I went into the legislature, and in working with the free market. So I think for me, what motivates me is that I believe that children are a gift from God. And I believe that we have a responsibility as adults to teach them the things that are right and to teach them the things that are correct about our country and to teach them principles for their lives, for them to have happy lives.
One of my former school teachers was in the 8th grade. We had to memorize the amendments to the Constitution, and what he did is you'd read them, and then he'd put the numbers on the opposite side. You had to match those up. You had to be able to get up in class and recite the preamble. You had to be able to look at a map of 50 states and identify what all the states were. He was a real stickler for this. He retired a few years ago, and then I was told by my sister not long ago that he now travels and he visits with various Tea Party organizations, teaching them about the Constitution. So he does this on a voluntary basis now. But It does show you that a lot of people just feel that they have to keep serving. But again, it's really still a small number, I would assume.
Well, I think it probably is. But, our founders were a small group of people, too. So, what I'm hoping is that we can create a lot of little pebbles that as they're dropped in a pond, there's a ripple effect. Back in the mid-'70s, I met a gentleman by the name of Ralph Smead, who started talking to me. He gave me Bastiat's The Law and The Incredible Bread Machine, Mainspring of Human Progress, some books that really impacted me. And And then he mentored me while I was in the legislature and helped me understand that sometimes well-intended bills have unintended consequences that are terrible. And so, we will teach the students about, we will actually have a panel to discuss the unintended consequences of bad legislation and how you identify principles so that they can, once they learn principles, then it gives them something that they can stand on.
Our guest, Elizabeth Allen Hodge, we're talking about the Northwest Regional Liberty Institute, or rather Academy, and that's just some details on this half hour, and for people who'd like to get involved and offering some ideas on how they might do that. 8:53 and 36 at our studios. I would say that what we have seen in this country in the last half dozen years is almost like a great awakening when it comes to the Constitution. And you might have the naysayers would say it was a reaction to the election of President Obama in 2008, but other people are going to say that whether or not that was the case, the fact of the matter is a great many more people have taken an interest in those founding documents and actually what they mean. Would you agree with that?
I think there is a new interest, and I think it's because of the things that are happening around the world as well as locally. I think people see an erosion of principle, and I think they see some of the threats. I mean, we've never had an attack on our own soil until 9/11, and I think people are suddenly aware of what would happen if we didn't have the liberties we have. My husband and I travel a lot. We've been in Asia the last several years. We spend several months over there each year. And when you travel into other countries, you hear the world news differently. And you realize that we are very blessed in this country to have the freedoms that we have.
8:54 now on our program, News Radio 1310 KLIX and Top Story with Bill Colley. Our guest, Elizabeth Allen Hodge. In the final minutes that we have together, is there anything that I didn't bring up that you think is really pertinent to this discussion as well as to getting people involved with the Academy?
Probably that the dates of our symposium would be helpful, Bill. It's June 17th through the 20th, so 17th, 18th, 19th, and 20th. It will be held in Boise. We will spend most of the time over at the state capitol having classes there, and then we will also be bused to and from the hotel. Now, the cost is $350 if people sign up before the 1st of May, but I can tell you that we also have some scholarships that are available to both students, younger students, and adults who may want to come. And we also have an essay contest that students can enter to win a scholarship. And there are 3 categories, ages 12 through 14, 15 through 17, and 18 and older, that will be winners. And it's a 500-word essay on what Thomas Jefferson meant by eternal vigilance and why the oath of office is a sacred oath and what that means.
$350 for 4 days, I think people would consider a bargain.
Well, we hope so. I mean, it's at this point we're hoping it will cover our costs, but because of some generous people, generous business people, we are able to offer that, and we are very blessed by the people that are on our advisory committee. And when they go on the website, they will see the members of our advisory committee, which includes some folks from your end of the state as well.
Very quickly, again, for people who didn't get that website address, if they'd like to take a closer look, what is that? nwlibertyacademy.org. Fairly simple to remember. You know, I always tell people I grew up watching TV where they would put that board up and they would give you an address or number, and you'd never have a pen or pencil around, and you'd be fumbling for one, and by the time you'd find something to write with, it would be gone. So I always have people repeat it at least one time, because it seems to help people out if they're actually looking for a piece of paper and something to write with. And it's been one of the great frustrations of my life. So,
I hear you. I hear you.
I thank you very much for your time this morning, and I hope we can talk again sometime soon.
Thank you, Bill.
Take care now.
Bye-bye.
Elizabeth Allen Hodge joining us this morning, and as she mentioned, talking about the Northwest, and this is regional, Liberty Academy and some of the events that they have coming up in June. And she got in touch with me a couple of months ago, and we've been talking back and forth about this. I've had a chance to go to the website on a few occasions, and I really would highly recommend you do that. And even if you didn't get the web address down, go to the website. You can just, if you go to your search engine on your computer, you can type that in, just do that, Northwest Regional Liberty Academy, and you'll find some of the details there. And fascinating to look at. And as I said earlier, if you have a young person, for instance, in your family who'd like to take part in this, and it might be the inspiration that leads them into a career. All right, I know people are going to say, I don't want my child to have a career in politics. But there are still a few noble people there. We just talked to one of them. Coming up on 9 o'clock, we have one more hour of the show. Speaking of noble, we've got somebody coming by from the Boy Scouts at 9:20 this morning. They'll be spending a few minutes with us talking about an event coming up. You don't want to miss that. Bill Colley with you. Fox News is next. You're listening to Talk Radio. Well, of course you're listening to Talk Radio. News Radio 1310 KLIX, newsradio1310.com. Breaking news reported by the Washington Examiner, and that is that President Obama has spoken with Raul Castro, the leader of Cuba. He's the younger brother of the current regime's founder. His older brother, of course, has been incapacitated for about 10 years. With an unknown illness, which likely means he's suffering from some form of Alzheimer's or dementia, and the younger brother has taken over. And Mr. Obama is going to be meeting with him, with the younger Mr. Castro, sometime soon in Panama, but the two have spoken. I would think that for American lefties, that this is an ideal sort of meeting. They've long, I'm sure, admired Fidel Castro and what he's done in his country, which is impoverish it and leave everyone there wanting for fresh seafood. My next door neighbor, did I ever tell you this story? When I was a kid growing up for many, many years, our next door neighbor, he was a native of Cuba. And his father had actually fought against Batista and briefly with Castro. His father was a doctor. And then when the Castro regime took over, his father was appalled to discover that Castro was actually a communist, because Castro kept that somewhat under wraps for a very, very long time. And he had a falling out, and with that, he lost his position. So one day when he got an opportunity, he sent all of his kids and his wife out of the country. But he ended up being closely guarded and watched by the government, and he couldn't get out himself. So my neighbor Jose and his family ended up moving to a rat-infested house near Hialeah, a racetrack in Miami. And he said where they'd come home from school and their sport was to go out on the porch roof and knock the rats off with brooms. And they'd gone from living as the family of a doctor and pretty good comfort in Cuba to suddenly he's in the United States and here he is, just an 11-year-old kid, and they're living in a rat-infested home. A couple of years later, his dad managed to get to a beach without getting spotted, saw an American ship out on the water, dove in and swam 2 miles to it. And his father was able to make it to Florida, ended up eventually getting his medical license in this country. Jose, meanwhile, wanted to fight communists. So during the Vietnam War, he went down to his local recruiter and said, "Send me, please." So he went into the army, and they sent him to Germany and made him a typist. So he got out of the army, went to school on the GI Bill. He became a school teacher and then eventually a school administrator, and now he teaches at something called St. Bonaventure University. But he was our next-door neighbor when I was a teenager, and he used to tell me the most fascinating stories. He said, growing up in Cuba, you always had plenty of fresh fish. After all, there's ocean everywhere. But he said when Castro came aboard, he started doing all this business with the Soviet Union. So what they would do is they would take the fresh fish and they would send it to Russia, and then it would come back canned. And he said it made people in Cuba miserable. You went from fresh fish to canned fish, and you were told this was better. And he said that just describes life under Castro. Plus, Castro, through his sidearm, Che Guevara, shortly after the revolution, they marched 3,000 people into a stadium and shot them all. So these have not been very nice people. But, American lefties just fawn all over Castro. And I'm sure Mr. Obama has been one of those who has just been idolizing the man for years. And meeting his brother, I guess, is the next best thing if you're a Saul Alinskyite. 9:10, Bill Colley with you this morning on Top Story. You're listening to News Radio 1310 KLIX and newsradio1310.com. 37 is our temperature. I have this I wanted to mention if I could, because this has been a saga we've been talking about nearly every day on the program. The Associated Press reports after 88 days in the Idaho legislature, lawmakers have pulled a rarely used card to settle the state's increasingly contentious transportation funding shortfall. Known as a conference committee, the 6-person joint panel met Thursday, discussing options on how to make some sort of dent in Idaho's $262 million annual transportation deficit. However, after meeting for nearly 7 hours, there was no movement. Well, hey, it's 4th down, let's punt. I had to share that today because, look, I think in some respects, the people who first founded our country and state governments generally modeled after what the federal government is built like, the idea was some gridlock was a good thing. You know, if we had them legislating all the time, they'd be creating they'd be promulgating regulations and laws that we've had enough of. And right now, in fact, regulatory agencies make most of the laws with no oversight from the public or from legislatures, but at least you have somebody here taking their time to think about it, I suppose. They've got to come to some sort of a solution, because eventually when the bridges all fall down, it's going to be a little difficult to get around the state of Idaho. And as we talked yesterday, a grant won't do it. I'm sorry, grant money is just taxpayer money. So you either pay your taxes here now or you pay them to somebody else for this. And if you get a grant, it's got to be laundered through both the federal bureaucracy and the state bureaucracy. It's simpler to do the job here on our own. But it doesn't look like it's going to happen anytime soon. And then I have this. This is coming out of neighboring Nevada. Yes, neighboring Nevada. How's that? And this is also from the Associated Press. This caught my attention this morning because this story, the rancher Cliven Bundy, remember when he had that issue in southeast Nevada a couple of years ago where they had the standoff because he had been grazing his cattle on what was called federal land, even though his family had been grazing cattle on that land long before the federal government seized it, going back generations. And then the media ran away from it, and then even conservative media dropped him like a hot potato because he has views about black people where he thinks that they're not very ambitious. How dare he? He's a racist bigot. Oh, come on. You know, I grew up in a small town where people told ethnic jokes all of the time. It meant nothing about how they really felt about people. And it has nothing to do with his argument about the federal use of the lands. I mean, I'm sorry, it doesn't. But that's just the way that the media used the excuse to sort of, wash their hands of this story and get away from it, even those on the right. But I'm bringing this up because Nevada lawmakers have passed a gutted version of a public lands bill that was supported by Bundy, but was widely considered unconstitutional. So I guess by gutting it, it's constitutional. Does that mean it's meaningless? And the writer goes on to say the original proposal would require the federal government to obtain permission to use the land within the state's borders. The proposal also strips the federal government of state water rights and would allow county commissions to parcel out land for commercial use. And the Legislative Council Bureau said the bill was unconstitutional. The rewritten bill deletes core proposals and instead says local sheriffs can enter into an agreement to patrol federal lands. Well, then you got to get the federal government to agree to that, right? Then it ain't happening. It also states that sheriffs are the primary law enforcement officers in unincorporated parts of their counties. Now, that notion of a constitutionally elected sheriff is gaining some ground. I've interviewed the Sheriff Richard Mack, who was from New Mexico and now living in, I believe, Texas. I've interviewed a number of these people in that movement over the years, and I've got to tell you, I'm fully on board with that. But all they're simply doing is making a statement that the sheriff is in charge, but he's not, because the federal government's in charge. You know what you've got to do? You've just got to say no. I mean, at some point, this is going to happen. You're going to get some people who've got a big set, and they're going to say enough of this, and they're just simply going to say, sorry, we're taking the land back. What is the federal government then going to do? Send in the jackbooted thugs? We'll tell you what. We've got sheriff's departments of our own. We have state police departments of our own. I really don't think the federal government wants that. Simply put this way, I'll use an analogy from European history. In the late 19 teens, going into the 1920s, the Irish were negotiating to break away from the British Empire. And if you know the story, and it's been dramatized on TV, and there are a great series, three books written by a guy named Tim Pat Coogan about how all of this came about. But what they ended up doing is they simply went forward and said, we'll make an agreement with the English. And the English came back and said, well, we'll make you a free state. That is, you can have your own parliament. That's called the Doyle. But you're still going to swear allegiance to the crown. And it split Ireland in two. And you had a civil war again between many of the factions that had fought together to try to win independence. So for about 15 years after this agreement was cut, the Irish went along with it. And then in 1937, the president of Ireland, Eamon de Valera, just simply came forward. And you know what Mr. de Valera did? In 1937, he says, this is an Irish republic. It's not England. And the English didn't do anything about it. What were they going to do? By that time, he had control of the civil service, the police, all but for 6 counties in the north, 2 of which had remained Roman Catholic, which is always a sticking point there. But he had control of the levers of government. And it would have been suicide for the British to come in and think that they were then going to put it down. Well, the federal government does not have the ability to stand up against the states and the liberty-loving peoples of the West. So at some point, if someone just said, these are no longer federal lands, well, the federal government will sue. All right, let them sue. And then we'll nullify whatever the results of that may be if it's in favor of the federal government, right? Well, why do you have to pay attention to it? Are they going to send in troops? I'll tell you what, I don't think that they have the stomach. And the public relations, what they call in Washington, the optics of that, would be a huge, huge mistake. And it would turn people against the federal government in such droves, even many on the left, to the point the federal government might lose all confidence. And then that could mean that federal government could topple. I tell you, there are a series of events that could happen like this. So I'm telling you right now, and they're aware of that in Washington. It's simply a matter of there are more of us than there are of them. And if we simply say we're done with all of this, there's not much they're going to be able to do about it. Just some thoughts for the day. Hey, I've got someone coming up in a couple of minutes from the Boy Scouts of America who'll be joining us. And a big event coming up tomorrow. They'd like to talk about that. And then in the last half hour, we'll just pretty much freewheel for the rest of the day. And in fact, I'll take some of your telephone calls as well. Because we've been guest heavy today, I'll point out that we will open the phones, and what we'll do is we'll talk to people. That number, write it down if you don't know it, 736-0300. That is 736-0300. You can also reach me at my email address, bill.colley@townsquaremedia.com. bill.colley@townsquaremedia.com. Last name is spelled Colley. And so there's another way to get in touch with me if you're so inclined this particular morning. And I do want to point out as well, you're listening to Top Story on News Radio 1310 KLIX and newsradio1310.com. My name is Bill Colley. In about a minute before our break, but a couple of other things too we'll mention if we get a chance before we wrap up today. That is that comment made by one of the leading Democrats in the country that President Obama and his pal Michael Bloomberg have to back off their calls for gun confiscation. And he says if they don't, Democrats next year are going to take a bath in elections nationwide. You know what, Mr. Obama? Keep talking. Keep talking. I think we'll love it. Go right ahead. We're all on board with that. As long as he wants to submarine all of his fellow Democrats, I'm in. And very quickly, before we do wrap up this segment of the program, a great many people make this show possible, including the folks at Western States Bus Services, where they are hiring part-time bus drivers right now, split shifts, 5 days per week, summers off, and scheduled no school days. The pay is $10.75 an hour. Apply today by contacting 733-8003. Western States Bus Services is an equal opportunity employer. More coming up. As I say, the Boy Scouts of America have a representative coming in. Hope you can stick around. Coming up on Wednesday next week, we'll be joined by our good friends at Tripp Family Medicine. You may already be familiar with them from their previous appearances on the show with us, or you may actually be a patient, and so you would be obviously familiar in that sense. Join us every week between 8:30 and 9 o'clock, right here on News Radio 1310 KLIX and newsradio1310.com for better health with Tripp Family Medicine. The doctor will be in this coming week. What we'd like to do is obviously open it up to some conversation with some folks in the listening audience, so that if you have questions or comments, you've got the doctor here, or sometimes a nurse, sometimes a physician assistant, and they can answer those questions for you. And I think this is a great opportunity, especially since we all have concerns about our health. Well, we should. I don't know anyone anyone at this point who doesn't. But we're going to be talking about just areas of the body next week. Head, cuts, wounds, shoulder pain, muscle pain, torn biceps, and the like. So all of these things, bruises. Oh gosh, when I was a kid, I don't know how I got bruised so often. When I was playing football, it made sense. My shins and my arms were always black and blue for a couple of months, But the rest of the time, I just seemed to be bumping into everything and always had these big black and blue marks on my thighs and on my shins. And somebody would say, what happened to you? And I have no idea. Part of living, I suppose. But that's coming up next Wednesday. Tripp Family Medicine is located on Fillmore Street in Twin Falls, directly across the road from the main post office. I was mentioning, if I could, we're just juggling with a guest here at the moment. So what I'm going to do is talk a little bit about what I was going to talk about in the next segment, and that is the fact that somebody who would speak out against the Second Amendment would have a very difficult time winning an election next year. Seth MacLaughlin, writing at the Washington Times, Obama-Bloomberg gun control agenda worries Democrats heading into 2016. Now, why is that? Well, again, we talked about it yesterday. Nearly 400 million guns in private hands in this country. And even if some people have multiple guns, that still means a lot of Americans are gun owners. President Obama said this week he hasn't given up on pushing for tighter gun controls, but many of his fellow Democrats in Congress are wishing he would drop it, having concluded the issue as an electoral loser. In fact, a guy by the name of Dave Mudcat Saunders, a Democratic strategist and lifelong gun owner, says this, quote, how many gun owners are there in America now? Look it up. There is a bunch of them, and anytime you start talking about guns, you are going to take from your numbers. So there is just less talk about gun control now than there has been in forever, unquote. Remember a few years ago, we had a whole string of shootings. They were horrible, tragic, and there's nothing else that you can't sit here and say anything good about that. But they all seem to come in such a short time when there was such a big push for more gun legislation, gun control in this country. I'm not trying to imply anything, but have you ever heard the phrase false flag attack? And you know what that means? Suddenly there were all of these shootings that were taking place. And then, we either hear that the people are nuts or that they ended up getting killed themselves or killing themselves. And so they're not around to talk about it afterwards. But that pushed people forward. I had the impression at the time that the American left was sitting there rubbing their hands together going, oh boy, there are bodies everywhere. We're going to be able to take away people's guns. And you know what? That was frightening in itself. That they were such opportunists that over the dead bodies of children in many cases, that they would press forward with their political agenda. You make a school safe by simply, putting some locks on the doors and the like, and doing things in that sense. And buzzing people in if they want to come in and asking them why they happen to be there. There are any number of things you could do. But this notion that somehow you're going to disarm, again, people with nearly 400 million guns in private hands in this country, there is simply no way anybody is going to be going door to door taking them away. And there is an old phrase that has been repeated many, many times. I have a coffee cup at home that has this phrase on it. It reads, Molin Lobby. And do you know what that means? It's an old Greek phrase. It means come and take them. That is attributed to the Greeks at Thermopylae. As the Persians were advancing, and the Persian emperor said, throw down your arms. And the Greeks responded, Molin Lobby. And then they, for 3 days, delayed the much larger force and ended up in rolling back the invasion because of it. So here you go. You don't have any, despite what they're saying, and in some states, New York is a very liberal state. Following the Newtown, Connecticut shootings, New York went ahead and passed some very strict gun laws. Do you realize, I think that they said at one point, 600,000 firearms owners in New York State had refused to comply with the registration. That is what you call nullification. There is simply no way, and this was what I was talking about in the previous segment when it comes to federal lands, there is simply no way that government can chase down 600,000 people. They might grab 6 or 60 and throw them in the dungeon, but they can't stop it. And so what happened there was the public just simply ignored the law. You can't enforce a law when the public ignores it. We have a moment to listen to some of our fine sponsors coming up. Bill Colley with you today on News Radio 1310 KLIX and newsradio1310.com. This is Top Story. About half an hour left in our show. And I've got a couple of other things, too, on the way. If you can stick around with us, I'd like to mention some of these things, too. Oh, do you know the Chinese are, well, I'll tell you what. We'll get to that in a few minutes. Not very nice people, though. There was a ceremony at Fort Hood this morning. Some of you may have heard about this. The wounded, it's been several years now, that the wounded who were still, who lived, because a great many died after a raving mad Muslim captain by the name of, well, what was it? They called him Hassan, right? It wasn't Hassan, it was Hassan. Nidal Hassan just decided to start shooting people up. Now, there's an old law that will allow, you cannot have these firearms on base, so people couldn't defend themselves, of all places. And this guy just decided to turn on his fellow soldiers, and they had a ceremony today, finally recognizing that it was more than just workplace violence, that was part of the war on terror, and the people who had survived, the wounded, received their Purple Hearts today. My friend Doug Beatty, who I've mentioned before, Doug was a talk show host. We worked together for a couple of years at a radio station back east, and Doug grew up in Virginia, and I remember him telling me that he knew the Hassan family, and he said that Major Hassan's father was actually a pretty nice guy, and he said, you had no sign that these were Islamic extremists. He said, something happened, the wheels fell off with the son, with the Nidal Hassan, because he said, I knew him when he worked in his dad's restaurant, and he said, you would have thought he was normal. But apparently got on the internet, got radicalized, women wouldn't go out with him, got angry at the world, and decided he was going to shoot up his fellow troops. 9:35, Bill Colley with you. 40 at our studios. You can reach our program today by dialing 736-0300. And that's News Radio 1310 KLIX, newsradio1310.com, and you're on the air.
Bill, it's amazing to me that the stats show everything to be true. All the places that they have the highest gun control has the highest murder rate. And the places that have the most relaxed gun control and have the most guns have the lowest rate. It's just like that military thing. Who's gonna start opening fire if they think they're gonna be shot at?
Right. It's a big deterrent. Bill Whittle, who is he does a piece on the internet. I've forgotten the name of it now, but he does like these weekly videos and he takes various topics. And he did a rundown in one of his videos. And if you actually take by the numbers, the United States is among the safest places on the planet when it comes to gun violence. No matter what the media tells you, I think the United States is like 118th. And yet, on the other hand, if you eliminated all of America but for Detroit, Chicago, Baltimore, places like that, then the United States would be among the top 10 most violent. However, if the United States was like Plano, Texas, where they don't have concealed carry laws, everyone's allowed to carry if they'd like to. Plano, Texas has among the fewest homicides by gun anywhere in the world.
Yeah, the stats show over and over, but they will not look at that. They want our guns so they can control us. And I say they can come get mine barrel first.
Look down this, please. Yes. Hey, thank you much for the telephone call, sir. It is a truism. If they would just give you the actual facts, the only reason that we have numbers that move the United States up as high as 118th, Bill Whittle, if you check him out, just go. You can actually go. You can search him on the computer. If you put in Bill, the last name was spelled Whittle, and you can start seeing his videos. It was a recent video within the last couple of months that he put together. They're worth all watching. I'll be honest about that. I mean, this guy is really spot on and on the mark. But when he tells you the number is so low for the United States, You wouldn't get that impression, though. If you turned on ABC, CBS, NBC, MSDNC, CNN, or read the New York Times and Washington Post, you would think that this is one of the most dangerous and violent places to be on the planet. On the other hand, those cities that are all run by Democrats and historically have had, or tried to impose, despite what the Supreme Court says, tried to impose draconian gun laws, they have the worst gun homicide rates. And if they stood alone, aside from the rest of the United States, yes, they would be among the worst in the world. You know what's really fascinating about this? The court has already ruled and slapped these cities around and said you can't do this. And you talk about nullification. Lefty jumps up and down when he hears me talking about federal lands or not registering for gun confiscation. But you know what? In these very cities, you want to talk about nullification? The Marxist-Leninists who run these major cities and have run them for decades, run them into the ground, they turn right around and then they adopt a new set of laws, which are in violation of what they were already told they can't do. And it still happens. The highest court in the land, the Supreme Court of the United States, ruled against them. And yet they show no shame. They turn right around and they say, well, we're not going to listen to that. So there you go. The next time one of those kooky lefties calls me and says I'm whipping up people into insurrection and that I do not live by the letter of the law, let me tell you what they do, they tend to ignore that, don't they? 20 minutes away from 10 o'clock. Bill Colley with you this morning. 40 is our temperature. You're listening to News Radio 1310 KLIX and newsradio1310.com. And about 20 more minutes, we'll have Mike Huckabee too in about 10 minutes. And the governor will talk, of course, today about, I'm sure, anything that's on his mind. And there usually is a lot on his mind. And Rush Limbaugh, of course, following news at 10 o'clock from Fox. Some of you likely heard my friend, Lieutenant Colonel Steve let me try that again. Lieutenant Colonel Steve Heil. My throat got caught up there. He's been on the program with us a couple of times. Of course, once on the anniversary of the Shuttle Challenger disaster. He was the administrator of the Shuttle Challenger Commission. And then he was on the air with us a couple of weeks ago when he was debunking a conspiracy theorist here on the air who was making claims that Dick Cheney, was sitting in a dark room planning the 9/11 attacks long before Dick Cheney became vice president. And Colonel Heil called in and sounded off. And I said that he knows a lot of people because of his experience in the Air Force and with the Pentagon. First of all, he went to college, undergraduate at Ohio University with Roger Ailes, who runs Fox News now. And then served his time in the U.S. Air Force, got to know Curtis LeMay and J.C. McConnell, who were both former Air Force chiefs of staff. He worked for President Reagan. He worked for the first President Bush, actually lived for a time with the Bushes while they were planning the second Reagan inauguration. And so he has a long history. And then he worked with Tom Clancy, the famed author Tom Clancy. The two of them worked together when Baltimore was setting up the 175th anniversary of the battle at Fort McHenry. But Steve went to school for an MBA at Indiana, and one of his classmates happened to be Mike Krzyzewski, who just won another NCAA basketball tournament. Now, Krzyzewski has a long history, also has some association with West Point before that, but he served in the Army. And Steve sent this along to me just a few minutes ago, and this comes from something called the Conservative Tribune. And apparently Coach K was speaking to a group of Army officers getting an award after his latest title, and he said, "I know it's upsetting to many of you when you hear no boots on the ground. It upsets me too, because that's like saying, I'm not going to play two of my best players." He then went on to talk about the fundamentals of war, saying, quote, "It's about letting your opponent know that we are going to use our best players. Now, whether you use them or not, that's up to the coach. You never tell an opponent you are not going to use them," unquote. So that's comments from a very successful and great American, probably the best basketball coach in the history of the game. And I wanted to share that quickly with you this morning because there is a story out at the Weekly Standard. This led the Drudge Report for a good part of this morning. Ayatollah Khamenei accuses White House of lying, being deceptive, and having devilish intentions. It might be the first time I've ever agreed with an Iranian Ayatollah. 9:46. Bill Colley with you this morning. 42 at our studios. This is Top Story on News Radio 1310 KLIX and newsradio1310.com. Apparently, he's been sending out tweets. I didn't know that these Islamic radicals did this, but he's been sending out tweets, and they've been getting increasingly vicious. By the time he got to number 4, which is featured here in this story from the Weekly Standard, he got to number 4. Or no, it was the third tweet. The Ayatollah calls into question the Obama administration's integrity. The fact sheet was supposedly an example of the White House's lying. Khomeini's Twitter feed contains this post, quote, I trust our negotiators, but I'm really worried as the other side is into lying and breaching promises. An example was the White House fact sheet, unquote. Quite a long story here, and apparently this has been going on now since sometime yesterday. This guy, Khomeini, is dying of cancer, we're told, but he must have come out of his stupor briefly and decided to chime in. What's funny is you see all of these people saying, well, we can deal with the Iranian moderates. As if somehow you've got the Ayatollahs who run the country, and then you've got the politicians, and then you've got the Iranian military. But you see, the politicians only serve at the Ayatollah's pleasure. So they're not independent. If they were moderate, they wouldn't be serving at the Ayatollah's pleasure. And the Iranian military, they're all hooked up with these guys too, because if you cross the Ayatollahs, well, you'll get cashiered from the military, and you might end up getting strangled too. So you understand when we keep hearing these people in Washington saying, oh, we'll be dealing with the Iranian moderates. There's no such thing. I mean, it just shows you the abject idiocy of the people that we're dealing with, that they literally believe that they can do this. I had a professor of mine in college, speaking of military officers, he served in the Navy in World War II, badly injured by a kamikaze attack. He had a difficult time walking. But he used to tell us, he used to quote some European diplomat who said that you just cannot understand how much stupidity actually goes into the running of the world. Now, this old professor of mine, long dead now, he had actually been a student in Germany, and he heard Adolf Hitler speak, and then after the war, after he served in the U.S. Navy, he went back to Germany, and he said he heard some other people speak who were a bit more mild, but he had seen the worst of totalitarianism. And trust me, he knew as well what the Iranians were all about, and he knew as well what the communists were about back in the 1980s. He said there's always this notion among American liberals that we're going to have, as he would put it, a dialogue. And that was the comment he would use. We're going to have a dialogue. And yet the other guys don't believe in a dialogue, whether they be communists or Islamic republics. So what in blazes are we doing? Who are we talking to? If Kerry and Obama and Valerie Jarrett really want to have a conversation that's worthwhile, or at least better than what they're getting right now, then go into a closet and talk to the wall. You'll get better success. Governor Mike Huckabee is coming up in just a moment with the Huckabee Report, brought to you exclusively by the financial advisors at Waddell & Reed in Twin Falls. You can reach them at 736-6563. That is 736-6563. And, of course, I'll have a couple of minutes to wrap up following that. About 9:54 or so, we'll wrap up with about 3-4 minutes. And then Rush Limbaugh will be up following news at 10 o'clock right here, as always, on News Radio 1310 KLIX and newsradio1310.com. This is Top Story with Bill Colley. Thank you very much, Governor Huckabee. I'm just looking at a headline from Time Magazine, and it says that by 2020, 60 million American women will be postmenopausal. Now, perhaps Hillary Clinton should wait another 4 years before she runs for office. She'll have this great big voting block in 2020. She is expected to announce over the weekend via Twitter. She doesn't want to do it in front of a crowd because they may have some difficult questions. Her people say she is going to campaign in front of small groups. In other words, handpick the crowd so you can handpick the questioners, and she can avoid media and doesn't have to talk about destroying evidence, such as wiping clean the server that she was using, her personal server, while she was Secretary of State. Ah, my friends. And you know what? They say Republicans are evil. It's 9:55. Bill Colley with you. 42 on 42 on my thermometer. It might be a little different on yours, but it's going to warm up, and it's going to be quite a nice day. Up into the mid to upper 60s, perhaps, before it's done. And then a little cooler over the weekend. And 75 on Monday before we get some rain in here on Tuesday of next week. And then we'll warm things back up, toward the end of next week as well. So both weekends ahead look like they're going to be quite nice. I've been talking this morning just about some people who've lost their minds in various government positions, or in academia, or in entertainment or media. And I came across this today, just to wrap up. This is from a Chicago Tribune op-ed titled, Teach Arabic in Public Schools. Brian T. Edwards, Crown Professor in Middle East Studies and founding director of the Middle East and North African Studies program at Chicago's Northwestern University, makes the claim that Americans are beset with anxieties about the Arabic language because of a widespread fear of foreign languages and, wait now, open and unchecked racism toward Arabs and, by loose association, non-Arab Muslims. And he said if we would all just learn Arabic, then we wouldn't have any of these nasty prejudices. I think he's going to recommend that it become mandatory. And I also mentioned something earlier today. I get this call about 3 times a week from that angry lefty. He's the only one who seems to be willing to pick up the telephone and call, and then he just, quickly shouts and then click, hangs up because, of course, he doesn't actually want to have a discussion with anybody because, well, he'd lose. But all of these American-hating leftists, there is a story out today. Daily Caller reports that a new documentary is coming. It was put together by Australians and Canadians. And it says that the Chinese government is literally killing 10 to 20,000 political prisoners a year simply to harvest their organs. So their organs can be used for transplants because, most of your Communist Party leadership there is already, wheezing and kicking the bucket well into their 90s after the Long March. And so what they're doing is they're actually taking people, political prisoners, condemned many times for just writing a letter that they shouldn't have written or for speaking out, and they take them into a room. One woman was gang raped for 3 days by 30 men, and then she had her organs harvested without anesthesia. And apparently this is taking place on a regular basis. When they want an organ from someone needs one over at the Politburo, they condemn a prisoner. The prisoner is strapped down. They don't waste any money on the anesthesia. They cut the prisoner open alive, painfully, yank out the organs that they want, and then they throw the prisoner into an incinerator, oftentimes while the prisoners are still gasping for breath. Yes, for all of the America-hating lefties out there, we've had a little discussion today about Iran and about the Chinese and about our just wonderful Islamic allies all over the world and our communist allies and the like. I want you to never forget that we have a lot of soft tyranny in this country right now. And if we don't turn around and correct that, we'll have what they have. Rush Limbaugh up following news from Fox at 10 o'clock. Sean Hannity following the news at 1 o'clock from Fox. And then this afternoon, Glenn Beck after 4 o'clock news from Fox. Dave Ramsey tonight. God willing and the creek don't rise, I'm back in this seat between 8 and 10 o'clock Monday morning.